What's up, guys? Today we're talking about the 5 whiskey myths that people actually believe.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to Gents Lounge. I'm George. This is Blake. If you have not hit that subscribe button yet, please do that right now. It really helps us out. We are here every week talking about men's fashion, lifestyle, and today, the 5 whiskey myths people actually believe. So I've been sipping bourbon and drinking whiskey with this guy for quite a long time, and we've learned quite a few things along the way, and honestly, I think we've both probably believed the majority of these myths at one point in our lives. But we grew up a little bit, and now we know a little bit better. So, number 1, the first myth that I want to cover is that all Scotch is smoky. Now that is just simply not true. So there is a lot of popular smoky Scotch that comes from Scotland, but there are 6 regions of Scotland and only one of them is really well known for producing smoky whiskey, and that is Islay. So if you see something that says Islay, smoke, or peat on the bottle, chances are that's going to be a little smoky. So not all Scotch is smoky. If you say, I don't like smoky Scotch, there might be a Scotch for you. And I can recommend a few in the description below if you guys want to check some of those out. So myth number 2, all bourbon has to be made in Kentucky. This is also not true. And some other people say that bourbon has to be aged 2 years or 4 years to be called bourbon. Also not true. So as long as whiskey that is 51% corn touches the inside of a brand new charred oak barrel, you can call it bourbon inside the United States. So it does have to be made in the US, but it does not have to be made in Kentucky. We have bourbons on our shelf from Colorado, from Sonoma. Now, they might not be great bourbons or they might not be your preference of bourbons, but they are still bourbon.
So I know this bourbon one really bothers you because people just associate with Kentucky with bourbon.
Well, people from Kentucky and people around bourbon really like to say, like, you can't call it whiskey because it's bourbon, but all bourbon is whiskey. Not all whiskey is bourbon, but all bourbon is whiskey. So, just because something, it's like calling spaghetti and ravioli not pasta. They are different, they are made differently, they taste different, but they are still all pasta.
So I think we should label that all bourbon is whiskey.
All bourbon is pasta. All right, guys, moving on to myth number 3. Darker whiskey is better than lighter whiskey. So the color of the whiskey has very little to do with the amount of flavor. You might be able to tell a little bit about the type of flavor you might be getting, but the amount of flavor that is in the whiskey is going to be very minimal by the color. And about, I'd say 30 to 40% of whiskey producers do add some caramel coloring to make the whiskey darker. So you're not actually knowing what color the whiskey actually is on some whiskeys.
So typically what really affects the color of the whiskey is the barrel that it's actually aged in.
Yes, so bourbon is aged in brand new charred oak barrels. So basically they burn the hell out of a wood barrel. So that obviously is going to give the whiskey some darker color. So Scotches, on the other hand, for the most part, take used bourbon barrels. So it's not going to get as deep of a darker color as quickly. But then a lot of Scotches also tend to finish and they take those bourbon barrel casks and pour the whiskey into a sherry cask, which is a very dark, deep red wine. So it tends to give that whiskey kind of a darker color. But then when you look at something like an Irish whiskey, those tend to be a little lighter because those are finished in bourbon casks and not transferred to a wine cask, but they're still very good whiskeys.
So now does an aged whiskey tend to be darker than a non-aged whiskey?
Yes, for the most part, the older something gets, the darker it will get, but it does depend on the barrel that it is aging in. All right, guys, so that brings us to myth number 4. Older whiskey is better than younger whiskey. So there is also a ton of different factors that go into flavor of the whiskey and how a whiskey tastes, and age is just one of them. So I've had 4-year-old whiskeys that taste better than 10-year-old whiskeys. I've had 26-year-old whiskeys that taste better than 15-year-old whiskeys. Age is really just a number, and you have to focus on really the flavors you like and look at a bunch of other things other than age.
Yeah, I mean, so many guys are consumed with the number. They want to get like a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old, but it's also very hard to get that amount of years in an actual bottle. And number 5, guys, expensive whiskey is better than cheap whiskey.
Yes, so I will say a $10 plastic jug of whiskey is probably going to be slightly worse than a $50 bottle of Scotch. But for the most part, there are a ton of other factors that affect price of the whiskey that not necessarily have to go with age or flavor. But basically, like if the bottles are more limited, if they spent more money on the shape of the bottle, if the producer only produced X amount of bottles, you're gonna get a more expensive whiskey. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better. It'll probably be slightly rarer because they have to make the same amount of money with less product than someone who's a massive producer of whiskey. Or if someone has, you know, a ton of brand clout and heritage like Macallan or Glenlivet, you can charge a little bit more because you have the brand name behind you. So there are a ton of different things that affect price that don't necessarily make for a better whiskey, but they do sell for more expensive and more amounts of money. And before we wrap this up, you can take Japanese whiskey as a very, very good example of this. I literally bought this guy a Yamazaki 12 for his birthday about 5 years ago, and I paid $65 for it. And if you look up Yamazaki 12 today, they sell for like over $300, which is absolutely ridiculous because yes, it was a great $65 whiskey, but I don't know if it's a great $300 whiskey.
No, I wouldn't say it's a $300 whiskey. I think it's the rarity.
Yeah, just you can't get it anymore.
No.
And you know, the Japanese whiskey won best whiskey in the world like 6 years ago, and then ever since then the category exploded and Japan just kind of wasn't prepared for that amount of sales. So now they don't put age statements on their whiskey anymore, and they do a lot less, you know, super old whiskey because they just don't have it. All right, guys, so that pretty much wraps up the video. I hope that was interesting. I hope you learned something. Comment down below which myths you actually believed because, you know, we've been guilty of most of those as well. So no hard feelings. But if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please do that right now. If you haven't followed us on Instagram over at gentslounge, give us a follow over there, and we'll see you on the next one, guys.
Cheers.